February 4, 1971. One of the most advanced engineering companies in the world, Rolls-Royce, runs out of money and collapses into receivership. At that moment, the company employs over 80,000 people, powers a significant share of global commercial aviation, and sits at the center of billion-dollar aircraft programs. Yet behind that dominance, a single project had already spiraled out of control. Development costs for its new jet engine had exploded far beyond projections, with losses climbing into hundreds of millions of pounds, an unsustainable burden for even the most prestigious manufacturer in Britain. The consequences are immediate and severe. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most technologically advanced passenger aircraft ever built, faces collapse without its engines. Airlines risk massive financial exposure, supply chains begin to freeze, and the British government is forced into emergency intervention within days. This was a company considered too important to fail. Yet it failed anyway. Not because demand disappeared or competition overtook it, but because the most advanced engine it had ever attempted to build, the RB211, pushed the company beyond its financial limits. The real question is no longer what went wrong. The question is how a company that mastered engineering lost control of everything else. Chapter 1. Origins and Philosophy. The story of Rolls-Royce begins not with scale, but with an uncompromising belief in precision. In 1904, Charles Rolls, a well-connected entrepreneur with access to Britain's emerging automotive market, partnered with Henry Royce, an engineer whose intolerance for imperfection defined everything he built. Royce was not interested in speed or affordability. His standard was far more demanding, machines that simply did not fail. At a time when early automobiles were unreliable and mechanically inconsistent, this philosophy immediately set Rolls-Royce apart. By 1906, their cars were already being recognized for a level of refinement and reliability that competitors struggled to approach, defined by smooth operation, mechanical silence, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. But what Rolls-Royce was really building was not just a product, it was a reputation anchored in certainty. Every component was engineered with the assumption that failure was unacceptable, not inevitable. This mindset created a level of trust that extended beyond customers into institutions, governments, and eventually entire industries. Rolls-Royce did not sell performance alone. It sold predictability in a world where machines were still learning how to function reliably. The defining shift came with the outbreak of World War I, when the company moved from automobiles into aircraft engines. Aviation at the time was still experimental, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it demanded exactly what Rolls-Royce had perfected: reliability under pressure. The company adapted quickly, applying its engineering philosophy to aero engines that would power a growing share of Britain's military aircraft. In doing so, Rolls-Royce transitioned from a premium manufacturer into a strategic industrial asset, deeply integrated into national defense and technological capability. By the interwar period, that transformation was complete. Rolls-Royce was no longer simply a respected brand, it had become an institution, one whose engineering standards influenced entire sectors. But embedded within this rise was a subtle and largely unrecognized shift. The same philosophy that demanded perfection also made compromise increasingly difficult. Engineering decisions were driven by ideals rather than constraints, and costs became secondary to achieving technical excellence. Perfection, in this context, was not just a strength, it was a constraint in disguise. Because as the company moved from craftsmanship into large-scale industrial responsibility, the environment around it began to change. Complexity increased, stakes expanded, and the cost of failure grew exponentially. What had once been an advantage in a controlled environment was slowly becoming a liability in a system that demanded not just excellence, but balance. Rolls-Royce had mastered engineering, but it was now entering a world where mastery alone would no longer be enough. Chapter 2. Rise to Global Dominance. By the time the Second World War engulfed Europe, Rolls-Royce had already built a reputation for precision. But war transformed that reputation into necessity. At the center of this shift was the Merlin engine, a piece of engineering that would power aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane, machines that became critical to Britain's survival during the war. These engines were not optional upgrades or competitive advantages. They were decisive factors in whether missions succeeded or failed. In a very real sense, the performance of Rolls-Royce engines directly influenced the balance of power in the air. This moment redefined the company. Rolls-Royce was no longer operating within a market. It had become embedded within the structure of national defense itself. Its engineering output was now tied to outcomes that extended far beyond profit or competition. It was tied to survival. That role did not diminish after the war ended. It expanded. As aviation entered the jet age, the industry underwent a transformation that reshaped global transportation. Aircraft became faster, more efficient, and capable of connecting continents in ways that had previously been impossible. Rolls-Royce positioned itself at the forefront of this transition, developing jet engines that would power both military aircraft and a rapidly growing commercial aviation sector. Air travel was no longer a limited luxury. It was becoming a global system, and at the center of that system were engines. With each new contract, Rolls-Royce moved deeper into the core of that system. Airlines depended on its technology to operate long-haul routes. Manufacturers relied on it to bring new aircraft to life. Governments trusted it to support defense capabilities. The company's influence extended beyond its factories into supply chains, economies, and international partnerships. Entire communities grew around its operations, their stability tied directly to its success. At this scale, Rolls-Royce was no longer just a company. It was infrastructure. Because if Rolls-Royce stopped, aircraft programs stalled. If its engines failed to deliver, airlines could not operate as planned. The modern aviation system, increasingly complex and interconnected, depended on its consistency. And that dependency created pressure. Because maintaining this position required more than reliability. It required constant advancement. Competitors were evolving, technology was accelerating, and the cost of staying ahead was rising rapidly. Leadership in this industry was not something that could be preserved. It had to be continuously re-earned. Rolls-Royce had reached dominance. Now it had to defend it. Chapter 3: Peak and Hidden Fragility. By the 1960s, Rolls-Royce appeared to have reached an unchallenged position at the top of global aviation. Its workforce had grown into the tens of thousands, its production network spanned multiple facilities, and its engines powered a significant share of the world's commercial and military aircraft. Contracts continued to flow from major airlines and defense programs, reinforcing its reputation as one of the most dependable engineering companies in the world. From the outside, the picture was clear: scale, stability, and sustained dominance. But beneath that stability, the economics of aviation had begun to shift in ways that were far less visible and far more dangerous. Jet engine development was no longer a controlled process. It had become a high-risk, capital-intensive race defined by complexity. New engines demanded advanced materials, longer testing cycles, and unprecedented levels of research investment. What had once been manageable development programs were now multi-year commitments with uncertain outcomes. Costs escalated rapidly, often long before any revenue could be realized. And yet, Rolls-Royce continued to operate with a mindset shaped by its earlier successes. Its commitment to engineering excellence remained absolute, but the financial structures surrounding that excellence had not evolved at the same pace. Fixed-price contracts, agreements that locked in revenue regardless of actual development cost, became increasingly hazardous in an environment where costs were no longer predictable. These contracts assumed control over variables that were, in reality, becoming uncontrollable. Inside the company, a critical imbalance began to take shape. Engineering teams pushed forward, confident that technical challenges could be solved with time and persistence. Leadership, influenced by decades of success, allowed that confidence to guide decision-making. The assumption was not that risk would be managed, it was that it would eventually resolve itself. They weren't managing risk, they were assuming it would work. That belief had been justified in the past. Rolls-Royce had built its reputation on overcoming technical challenges and delivering results that others could not. But the scale of those challenges had changed. Complexity had outgrown certainty, and cost had become as critical as capability. The margin for error was shrinking even as the ambition of each new project continued to expand. This created a dangerous illusion. On the surface, Rolls-Royce remained in complete control, profitable, respected, and deeply embedded in global aviation. But beneath that surface, its exposure to financial risk was increasing with every new commitment, every new contract, and every new technological leap. The company was still leading the industry, but it was doing so on increasingly unstable ground. And in that environment, maintaining leadership would require more than incremental improvement. It would demand a decisive leap forward, one that could secure its future or expose its vulnerabilities completely. That leap was already taking shape. The RB211. Chapter 4. The RB211 Gamble. By the late 1960s, the pressure to remain at the forefront of aviation had reached a breaking point for Rolls-Royce. The industry was shifting toward wide-body aircraft, and with that shift came a contract that seemed impossible to refuse. Lockheed Corporation was developing the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a next-generation passenger jet designed to compete on a global scale. Rolls-Royce secured the engine deal, placing itself at the center of one of the most important aviation programs of the decade. But the terms of that deal carried a hidden risk. It was a fixed-price contract, meaning the company would bear the full cost of development no matter how far it exceeded initial estimates. At a time when jet engine technology was becoming increasingly unpredictable, this was not just a financial commitment, it was a bet on certainty in an uncertain system. The RB211 engine was designed to justify that risk. It promised a step change in efficiency, weight reduction, and performance. Central to its design was a bold innovation: carbon fiber fan blades intended to reduce weight while maintaining strength. On paper, it represented the future of engine technology. In reality, it became the source of the crisis. During testing, the blades failed catastrophically under stress, unable to withstand real operating conditions. The solution was not a minor adjustment, it required a fundamental redesign. What followed was a cycle that began to repeat itself with increasing intensity: redesign, retest, delay, and cost escalation. Each iteration pushed the program further from its original timeline and deeper into financial uncertainty. Internally, the pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. In engineering reviews and executive meetings, the situation was no longer theoretical. One internal assessment revealed that development costs, initially projected at manageable levels, had already escalated beyond £100 million and were continuing to rise with no clear ceiling. In one meeting, senior figures were forced to confront a reality that had been building for months. The project was no longer operating within any predictable financial boundary. And yet, the decision was not to stop. Because stopping was no longer a viable option. Too much had been invested. Too many contracts had been signed. Too much reputation was tied to the outcome. Walking away would not just mean financial loss, it would mean conceding leadership in an industry where position was everything. So the program continued under mounting pressure. Engineers worked to solve technical failures, management worked to contain financial exposure, and both operated under the same assumption: that success was still achievable and that the next breakthrough would justify the cost. But each passing phase made that assumption harder to sustain. Costs continued to escalate, moving from tens of millions into hundreds of millions of pounds. Timelines slipped further, delivery commitments became increasingly unrealistic, and cash flow began to tighten under the weight of ongoing development. What had started as an ambitious engineering program was now consuming resources at a rate the company could not sustain. The nature of the crisis had changed. This was no longer about whether the engine could be built. It was about whether the company could survive long enough to finish it. By the time that distinction became clear, there were no meaningful options left. The company was locked into a project it could not abandon and unable to complete it without pushing itself toward collapse. The RB211 was no longer just an engineering challenge. It had become a financial trap, and Rolls-Royce was already inside it. Chapter 5. Collapse. In February 1971, the crisis inside Rolls-Royce reached a point where it could no longer be contained, negotiated, or delayed. After months of escalating losses and failed attempts to secure financial stability, the company formally entered receivership. On paper, it was a financial procedure. In reality, it marked the sudden collapse of one of Britain's most critical industrial institutions. The reaction at the national level was immediate and deeply unsettling. Government officials, already aware of the mounting crisis, now faced its full scale. This was not the failure of an isolated company. It was the potential breakdown of an entire industrial system. Rolls-Royce was embedded across defense contracts, civil aviation, and global supply chains. Its collapse threatened to disrupt aircraft programs, destabilize suppliers, and undermine international confidence in British manufacturing. But beyond strategy and policy, the impact unfolded in far quieter, more human ways. Inside factory floors, the change was immediate. Where production lines had once operated with constant motion and noise, uncertainty began to take hold. Conversations slowed. Machines continued to run, but without clarity about what would come next. For thousands of workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers inside these facilities, the announcement did not arrive as a distant headline. It arrived as a question with no answer. Would the next shift exist? Would the next paycheck arrive? Would the company they had built their lives around still be there in a week? In industrial towns built around Rolls-Royce operations, the shock extended beyond the factory gates. Local economies, dependent on the stability of a single employer, were suddenly exposed. Shops, suppliers, and small businesses, all linked to the company's presence, faced the same uncertainty. Stability, which had been assumed for decades, disappeared almost overnight. At the same time, the consequences spread rapidly through the global aviation system. Suppliers were left with unpaid contracts, placing financial strain across interconnected industries. Airlines, already committed to future fleets, faced the possibility that critical engine deliveries would never arrive. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, already delayed and entirely dependent on the RB211, stood on the edge of collapse itself. What had begun as a contained engineering failure had now expanded into a crisis with international consequences. But perhaps the most significant loss was not financial. It was trust. For decades, Rolls-Royce had represented certainty, machines that worked, systems that delivered, and a company that could be relied upon without hesitation. That certainty was now gone. International confidence in British industrial capability was shaken, and domestically, the collapse carried a quiet but undeniable sense of national embarrassment. A company that had once symbolized control and precision had revealed just how vulnerable it really was. By this stage, the crisis had moved beyond the reach of internal solutions. Management could no longer stabilize it. Markets could not absorb it. Time had already run out. There was no gradual recovery left. Only one path remained. The state would have to step in. Chapter 6: Government Rescue and Restructuring. The collapse of Rolls-Royce did not leave the British government with the luxury of careful deliberation. The situation was already too far advanced, the consequences too immediate. This was not a crisis that could be studied over months or negotiated through gradual policy. It demanded action within days. Because if Rolls-Royce stopped, critical aircraft programs stalled, defense capabilities weakened, and a chain reaction across the aviation industry became unavoidable. The government had days, not months. Within that narrow window, a decision was made that would redefine the company's future. The aerospace division was nationalized, not as an act of long-term ownership, but as an emergency measure to prevent systemic collapse. This was not about saving a brand, it was about preserving infrastructure. Rolls-Royce had become too deeply embedded in national and global systems to be allowed to fail outright. But stabilization came at the cost of identity. The company was broken apart. The aerospace business, responsible for jet engines and tied directly to national interests, was brought under state control. The car division, despite carrying the iconic Rolls-Royce name, was separated and eventually sold. What had once been a unified symbol of engineering excellence was now divided, its legacy split between two very different futures. Inside the newly nationalized structure, priorities shifted immediately. Financial discipline replaced engineering freedom as the dominant constraint. Liabilities were absorbed, obligations restructured, and funding was secured to keep critical programs alive. This was no longer a company operating on reputation and ambition, it was operating under survival conditions, where every decision was measured against cost, risk, and deliverability. At the center of this effort remained the RB211. Despite being the cause of the collapse, it could not be abandoned. Too many international commitments depended on it, and too much had already been invested. Under government oversight, development continued, but with a fundamentally different approach. Timelines were scrutinized, costs were controlled, and the margin for error was no longer theoretical, it was enforced. And gradually, the results began to change. Technical problems were resolved, performance targets were met. The engine that had once symbolized failure began to prove its viability. In time, the RB211 entered service, going on to power aircraft reliably for decades. There was a clear and unavoidable irony in this outcome. The engineering itself had not failed. The vision had not been flawed. What had failed was the system surrounding it, the inability to align ambition with financial reality. But survival did not mean restoration. The Rolls-Royce that emerged from this crisis was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. Independence had been replaced by oversight, confidence had been replaced by caution, and the culture that once prioritized perfection above all else was now forced to operate within limits it could no longer ignore. The company had been saved, but only by becoming something it had never been before. Chapter 7. Legacy and Industrial Meaning. The 1971 collapse of Rolls-Royce was not just a corporate failure, it was a signal that something deeper was shifting within industrial Britain. For decades, British manufacturing had operated with a sense of permanence, built on legacy, reputation, and technical mastery. Companies like Rolls-Royce were not simply successful businesses, they were proof that Britain still held a central position in the global industrial order. Their dominance suggested continuity, stability, and control. But that assumption did not survive the 1970s. The global landscape was changing faster than legacy institutions could adapt. Competition intensified, particularly from the United States and emerging industrial economies. At the same time, technological progress became more expensive, more complex, and far less predictable. Innovation was no longer just about capability, it was about managing risk, controlling cost, and surviving long enough to deliver results. Rolls-Royce exposed what happened when those elements fell out of balance. At its core, this story is not about failure, it is about misalignment. The company continued to innovate at the highest level, pushing the boundaries of what jet engines could achieve. The RB211 was not a flawed idea, it was a technological breakthrough, but innovation alone was no longer enough. The systems required to support that innovation, financial discipline, risk management, strategic restraint, had become just as critical as engineering itself. This is where the contradiction emerges. Rolls-Royce succeeded in building the future, but nearly failed to survive it. The collapse also challenged a deeply rooted belief in industrial economies, the idea that certain institutions are simply too important to fail. Rolls-Royce was essential by every measurable standard, economically, strategically, and technologically. Yet it still collapsed, not because it lacked relevance, but because relevance could not protect it from financial reality. And that is what makes this moment significant beyond a single company. It marked the beginning of a broader transition where legacy alone could no longer guarantee survival and where even the most advanced organizations were forced to confront the limits of their own models. In the end, Rolls-Royce did not fail because it stopped innovating. It failed because it believed innovation was enough. They proved engineering excellence, they proved technological leadership, but in the moment it mattered most, they ignored survival.